The day my father walked out of that city council chamber with tears in his eyes was the day I stopped believing that arrogance was just an annoying personality trait. Sometimes it isn't. Sometimes it becomes dangerous. Looking back now, people always ask me if I set out to ruin a millionaire developer because he embarrassed my dad in public. The truth is no. I set out to answer one question that refused to leave my head. Was he really as smart as he acted, or was everyone simply too afraid to question him? My name is Emma Carter. I'm 33 years old, a licensed civil engineer specializing in structural foundations, and I work for a consulting firm outside Philadelphia. My father, Richard Carter, retired 3 years ago after spending over 4 decades designing bridges, hospitals, schools, and more buildings than I could ever count. Growing up, I never learned bedtime stories from him. I learned why concrete cracks, why buildings settle, and why the strongest structures are the ones nobody notices because they simply keep standing year after year. Dad used to tell me, people admire skyscrapers, but nobody ever thanks the foundation. At the time, I thought it sounded boring. Years later, I'd realize he wasn't talking about buildings anymore. Everything started on an unusually warm Tuesday evening when the city hosted a public planning meeting for a proposed 26-story luxury residential tower near the old waterfront district. The project belonged to Ironcrest Urban Development, one of those companies whose glossy advertisements promised to reshape the future every 6 months. Their president, Dylan Mercer, was 38, polished, confident, and carried himself like every room belonged to him before he even walked inside. Tailor navy suit, expensive watch, perfect smile, expensive words. The kind of guy who could make investors applaud before showing a single blueprint. Dad wasn't there to cause trouble. In fact, he almost skipped the meeting. He only went because he'd spent most of his career studying the old industrial riverfront, where factories had dumped fill material decades before anyone cared about environmental standards. Over dinner that afternoon, he casually mentioned, "That parcel has always worried me. I like to hear how they're handling the foundation." Nothing more dramatic than that. We even joked that he'd probably be home before the baseball game started. I couldn't attend because I was wrapping up a design review at work, but one of my former professors happened to be in the audience and texted me halfway through the presentation saying, "Your dad just asked a very good question." I smiled when I read it. That sounded exactly like him. He never grandstand. He asked questions that made people think. Later that night, though, another message came through. This one only said, "You should call your father." My stomach dropped before I even dialed his number. He didn't answer. So I drove straight to my parents' house. I found him sitting alone on the back porch in complete silence, something he almost never did. My mother quietly handed me a cup of coffee and whispered, "He hasn't said much since he got home." Eventually, Dad looked up and forced a smile that fooled absolutely nobody. "Meeting didn't go as planned," he said. I asked what happened. At first, he brushed it off, but Mom had already watched someone upload part of the meeting online. She handed me her tablet. There it was. Dad stood at the microphone, introducing himself simply as a retired engineer before asking whether independent geotechnical studies had been completed for the site because the old riverfront contained inconsistent fill material and historically unstable soils. It was a respectful question. Calm. Professional. He wasn't accusing anyone of anything. He wasn't trying to stop the project. He just wanted clarification. Dylan Mercer leaned back, laughed into the microphone, then looked around the room with that practiced grin people use when they expect an audience to laugh with them. "Sir," he said, "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but engineering has changed a little since your generation. Maybe leave 21st century construction to people who actually build things instead of people who collect retirement checks." The audience chuckled. He wasn't finished. "Besides," he added, "Google doesn't make someone an engineer." More laughter. "Why don't you head home and enjoy retirement? We've got licensed professionals handling this." That time, almost the entire room erupted. My father stood there for another second, nodded once, gathered his folder, and quietly walked away while strangers laughed behind him. What hurt the most wasn't the joke. It was the look on his face. It wasn't anger. It was disappointment. The kind you see when someone realizes respect has become optional. I shut the video off before it ended because I couldn't stand watching another second. Dad shrugged like he was trying to comfort me instead of the other way around. "Forget it," he said softly. "He's young. Someday life will teach him things I can't." I remember staring at the blueprint tubes leaning against the wall in his workshop, thousands of hours of experience rolled into faded paper, and wondering how someone who'd probably never poured a footing in his life felt qualified to mock a man whose work still carried traffic every single day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I wanted revenge, because something about Dylan's answer bothered me. He never actually answered Dad's question. Not once. He laughed. He deflected. He insulted. But he never explained the foundation design. Around 2 in the morning, I finally sat down on my computer, opened the city's online planning portal, and searched for Ironcrest public filings. I told myself I was only going to spend 15 minutes satisfying my curiosity. 15 minutes turned into 3 hours. By sunrise, I wasn't thinking about the humiliation anymore. I was staring at one drawing on my monitor, zooming in over and over again, feeling the same chill crawl up my spine every engineer gets when something looks almost right, but not quite. And in my experience, not quite is exactly where disasters begin. By 8 o'clock that morning, I'd already canceled 2 meetings at work and called my managing partner to tell him I needed a personal day. He knew my father well enough not to ask questions. "Go figure out what's bothering you," he said. "You usually don't get that look unless you've found something important." He wasn't wrong. Engineers develop instincts the same way firefighters or surgeons do. Most of the time, you can't explain it immediately. You simply recognize that something feels off because you spent years looking at drawings that make sense. This one didn't. The foundation schedule listed drilled shafts far shallower than I would have expected for that section of the waterfront, and the more historical records I pulled from the city's public archive, the stranger everything became. The proposed tower sat on land that hadn't naturally existed 100 years ago. It had been created by dumping industrial fill into the river during expansion projects back in the early 20th century. Old maps, soil surveys, transportation records, everything lined up. Every major structure built nearby during the last 20 years had relied on deep foundations extending all the way to competent bearing strata. Ironcrest plans seemed to assume those layers were much closer to the surface than every available public record suggested. That didn't automatically mean the design was wrong. Sometimes additional borings reveal better conditions. But if that were true, the supporting documentation should have been easy to find. Instead, every document I expected to see either looked incomplete or had been summarized in unusually vague language. That was enough to keep me digging. Over the next several days, my apartment slowly disappeared beneath stacks of printed reports, historical maps, engineering manuals, permit applications, and city meeting transcripts. Coffee cups accumulated faster than I could throw them away. My mother called every evening asking if I'd eaten dinner. Most nights I lied and said yes. Dad never once asked what I was working on. In fact, he kept trying to steer the conversation toward baseball or fishing, almost as if he wanted to make sure I didn't waste my energy over one embarrassing afternoon. The more he tried to move on, the harder it became for me to let it go. One afternoon, I visited the Public Records office downtown to review archived geotechnical submissions that hadn't yet been digitized. The clerk recognized my engineering license, pointed me toward several storage boxes, and joked, "Have fun." Nobody asked for these anymore. 3 hours later, I found myself comparing boring logs from projects built within 2 city blocks of Ironcrest site. They all told essentially the same story. Beakfeed, compressible layers, significant depth before reliable bearing material. Yet Ironcrest's summary referenced conditions that appeared dramatically different. Possible? Yes. Likely? Not without extraordinary evidence. I requested copies of every publicly available appendix attached to the application. Some pages were there. Others referenced attachments that simply weren't included. That bothered me even more than the numbers themselves. Missing documentation doesn't automatically mean misconduct, but it certainly raises questions when you're asking a city to approve a 26-story structure. Around that same time, an email landed in my inbox from an address I didn't recognize. It contained only one sentence. "You're looking at the wrong report." There was no signature. Attached was a scanned cover sheet from what appeared to be an earlier engineering package bearing a different revision date than the one publicly filed. I almost deleted it, assuming it was fake, but curiosity won. The metadata looked old, not recently manufactured. I didn't trust it enough to rely on it, but it pointed me toward another request for archived revisions through the city's document retention office. Those files were legitimate. Comparing revision histories became the turning point. Several foundation details had changed substantially during later submissions, yet the supporting explanations barely changed at all. That isn't impossible, but major design revisions normally leave a very obvious paper trail because engineers document why decisions evolve. Here the trail seemed oddly thin. I call an old graduate school friend, Melissa Ortiz, who now specialized in geotechnical consulting. Without mentioning the project name, I asked her to review a handful of anonymous calculations. We spent nearly 2 hours on a video call marking up drawings together. Finally, she leaned back and said exactly what I'd been afraid of hearing. Emma, if these assumptions aren't supported by actual subsurface testing, I'd never stamp this design. She wasn't accusing anyone of fraud. She was simply stating professional judgment, and hearing another licensed engineer reach the same conclusion made my stomach sink. A few days later, another unexpected call arrived. The man on the other end introduced himself only as a former project coordinator who had briefly worked with Ironcrest before resigning. He refused to meet in public, so we sat in a quiet diner outside the city during a rainstorm that lasted almost the entire afternoon. He never claimed the company had broken a law. Instead, he described a culture where deadlines and budgets consistently outweighed uncomfortable questions. Every time someone asked for another round of testing, he said while stirring untouched coffee, management wanted to know how much it would cost and how long it would delay construction. Before leaving, he slid a small envelope across the table containing copies of internal scheduling memos and emails discussing repeated pressure to accelerate permitting. None of the documents alone proved wrongdoing, but together they suggested that speed had become more important than careful review. I drove home in complete silence, replaying the conversation over and over. By then, this wasn't about my father anymore. It wasn't even about Dylan Mercer. It was about the possibility that hundreds of families might someday trust their lives to decisions driven more by deadlines than engineering. That's a burden no licensed engineer can ignore. For nearly 3 weeks, I documented everything with obsessive care. Every statement in my report cited publicly available records, engineering standards, calculations, or supporting references. Whenever I encountered something uncertain, I labeled it uncertain. Whenever I reached a conclusion, I explained exactly how I reached it. The report eventually grew past 100 pages, complete with diagrams comparing historical soil data, foundation alternatives, peer-reviewed references, photographs, permit timelines, and a detailed list of questions that I believed deserved independent review before construction continued. I wasn't trying to convince anyone that I was right. I wanted qualified investigators to determine whether the project truly met professional standards. Before submitting anything, I drove to my parents' house carrying a thick draft copy in a cardboard box. Dad looked at the cover, sighed, and immediately understood what I'd been doing. Emma, he said quietly, don't do this because of me. I sat beside him in the garage where he'd taught me to read blueprints as a teenager. I'm not. I answered honestly. If this report ends up proving the project is perfectly safe, I'll be the first person relieved. He studied me for several long seconds before nodding once. Then make absolutely sure every sentence is something you can defend under oath. That was the best advice he ever gave me. Over the following week, I submitted the report simultaneously to the city's building department, the state engineering licensing board, and several oversight agencies responsible for reviewing construction safety concerns. I didn't leak anything. I didn't hold a press conference. I simply followed established procedures and waited. The waiting turned out to be harder than the investigation itself. Then the phone started ringing. First came requests for clarification from city reviewers. Then independent consultants asked for supporting calculations. A local newspaper called after learning that officials had opened a formal technical review of the foundation design. Within days, professional engineering publications began discussing the broader issue of transparency in large urban developments without reaching conclusions about Ironcrest project. Dylan Mercer finally responded during a televised interview, dismissing the entire review as noise created by people afraid of progress. He never mentioned me by name, but later that afternoon a law firm representing Ironcrest emailed demanding that I retract what they described as reckless allegations. My attorney replied with one sentence: "Our client welcomes any independent engineering review based on the evidence submitted." That response ended the conversation almost immediately. 2 weeks later, the city announced that construction activity would pause pending an outside technical evaluation. The review team included respected geotechnical specialists from firms with no connection to either side. I remember standing outside the construction fence watching drilling equipment sit perfectly still for the first time since the project began. It was strangely quiet, almost peaceful. Then, as I turned to leave, I heard someone behind me call my name. I looked back and saw Dylan Mercer walking toward me across the empty job site entrance, wearing the same expensive confidence I'd seen at City Hall. But this time there wasn't an audience laughing behind him. Dylan stopped a few feet away and folded his sunglasses into the pocket of his suit jacket like this was just another business meeting he expected to control. "You know," he said with a smile that never reached his eyes, "people like you could destroy years of work with a stack of paperwork." I looked at him for a moment before answering. "Paperwork doesn't stop projects. Bad engineering does." His smile disappeared. "You really think you're going to win this?" he asked. "This review will be over in a week, and everyone will forget your little campaign." I shook my head. This was never a campaign. Then I turned around and walked away because there was nothing left worth saying. A week later, the independent review panel released its preliminary findings. They didn't copy my report word for word, and they weren't supposed to. They conducted their own analysis, ordered additional testing, reviewed historical records, and interviewed everyone involved in the design process. Their conclusion was simple. The original foundation assumptions required substantial reevaluation before construction could safely continue. The city immediately suspended the existing permits while the design underwent a complete technical review. Watching the news conference from my office, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. That's the strange thing about engineering. The best outcome is usually the one where nothing dramatic ever happens because the problem gets caught before anyone gets hurt. Over the following months, investigators continued examining project records, permitting decisions, and internal communications. Several regulatory issues unrelated to my original report eventually surfaced during that broader review, leading to administrative actions against multiple parties involved in the project. Ironcrest investors began pulling out one by one as delays mounted and redesign costs climbed into the millions. The company that had once promised to transform the skyline quietly sold the property to another development group willing to start over with a completely new design. Months later, that new owner invited my firm to participate in the foundation engineering review. Ironically, I found myself standing on the very same site where all of this had started, this time surrounded by engineers who spent hours debating soil conditions instead of dismissing questions. Nobody cared who had the fanciest degree or the biggest title. We challenged one another's calculations, checked every assumption twice, and welcomed criticism because that's what responsible engineering looks like. When my first consulting payment from that project arrived, I drove straight to my parents' house instead of depositing the check. Dad was in the garage restoring an old workbench he'd probably rebuilt 3 different times over the years. I laid the envelope on the table without saying a word. He looked at it, then looked back at me. "What's this?" he asked. "The first check from the redesign," I said. "I figured it belonged here before it belonged at the bank." He smiled, not because of the money, but because he finally understood why I'd refused to let the whole thing go. After a long silence, he picked up one of his old carpenter's pencils and tapped it gently against the workbench. "Remember what I used to tell you?" he asked. I nodded before he even finished. "People admire the building," I said, "but everything depends on the foundation." He laughed softly. "That's true for people, too." Looking back now, I don't think the biggest lesson was about construction or engineering licenses or million-dollar developments. It was about humility. Experience doesn't become worthless because someone grows older, and confidence isn't the same thing as confidence. The strongest professionals I've ever met are usually the first ones willing to answer difficult questions instead of laughing at the person asking them. Sometimes all it takes is one moment of arrogance to reveal everything someone doesn't know. So here's what I'd genuinely like to ask you. If you had been sitting in that city council meeting, watching an older engineer get laughed out of the room for asking what turned out to be an important question, would you have spoken up, or would you have stayed quiet like everyone else? Let me know what you honestly think in the comments, because I still wonder how differently that day might have ended if just one person in that room had chosen respect over applause. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. I read as many comments as I can, and I'd love to hear your perspective.